Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Rogue Agent Answers. My name is the Rogue Agent. Some people call me David Lewis, and every week I answer one of the many life insurance related questions that I've received from clients, from email subscribers on the daily email list, questions floated to me from across the interwebs, in the comments sections, which I know you're not supposed to read, or just interactions that I've had with people in real life over the past 20 years, which is a long time. And some of these questions I just scribbled down on scrap pieces of paper. Some of these are stuff I've written down on my phone. Some of it is on Post-it notes scattered all over the office. And every week I answer one of those questions. So if you'd like to ask your question, drop them in the comments section or join my email list for more life insurance tips and advice at monogenics.com. monegenics.com. And now for this week's question. How does the company calculate a dividend for my whole life policy? Simple question, complex answer. So I have covered this on the blog in extensive detail, but I will try to do that here also. I'll start with a shorter version first and then go a little bit deeper. So the shorter version is that your insurance company collects premiums from you, subtracts out the mortality and operational expenses associated with your policy, and then adds back in the dividend interest rate, or really the guaranteed rate, dividend rate, and any M&E credits that are due also on the policy. So the total interest credits on your policy are based on really a combination of the guaranteed rate, any savings that the insurance company has from mortality experience, meaning fewer people dying than expected, and then savings from operational expenses, which means less money spent running the business than they had originally budgeted for that policy. So, and believe it or not, like the insurance companies tend to be very conservative, so they in some ways overestimate certain expenses. They do that a little bit on mortality, although there's not too much of an incentive to do that on that. They're not trying to make an underwriting profit. That's generally not how insurance companies run these days. Maybe that was true at some point in the past, but that's not how carriers run their business now. So for the most part, you're not looking at something like that. And then interest rates, operational expenses. So carriers, they want to be somewhat conservative on those because they don't know, they have a pretty good idea of how much it's going to cost to run the business, but they also want to be conservative just in case. So some people accuse insurance companies of sort of overcharging or overestimating, and then it's easy for them to just refund the difference back in the dividend and call it a high dividend. There are limits to that, because if you overdo that, it pumps the dividend, but then it also puts strain elsewhere, and they have to bake that into the cost of the policy because they have to assume guaranteed charges and they have to assume like the policy is supposed to perform a certain way. So they can't jack it up so much that they become uncompetitive, because that has to show up eventually. Those if they were really seriously overcharging policyholders, that would eventually show up in the premium, because they have to account for that somewhere, and that ultimately gets charged to the policyholder. And there's not just one insurance company, there's like a bunch of insurance companies, and it's not just mutuals competing against other mutuals, although in depending on what you're buying for, maybe your only competition is basically like the 5 old mutuals. But the insurance companies look at it, and the way a lot of most customers shop is you're not just competing with 4 or 5 companies, you're competing with like hundreds and hundreds of different companies. So they're not going to be so conservative as to be non-competitive, because they do still want to win the business. And a lot of policyholders are, like it or not, are premium sensitive. So they're willing to pay a lot, especially for whole life insurance. They are willing to pay a higher premium, but there's limits to that. So anyway, operational expense savings from coming in under budget. And then finally, interest and capital gains from investments, possibly including gains from the insurer's interest maintenance reserve, or from other one-time investments that they made. Sometimes, like if they sell off assets, supplemental lines of business, or other investments that they had, and then they can add that to the dividend. And then obviously any excess interest they earned on bonds that exceeds the guaranteed rate that they need for the policy. So the dividend on your whole life policy is made up of a combination of those three things: the savings from mortality, savings from operational expenses, and then interest gain. And then the basic interest payments are made from the guaranteed rate that for the policy. So the slightly more in-depth process looks like this. So the insurance company looks at the death benefits that it had to pay out last year, plus all the other expenses associated with running the business. Then it looks at the investment gains it made, along with any savings from mortality experience in business operations. The insurer may also look at whether it has excess surplus capital, money from the carrier's interest maintenance reserve, and that it can apply to dividend payments. And then combined, this money becomes what's called divisible surplus. And that's what the company will use to pay a dividend to all policyholders. And they divide it up, across all policyholders, not by dollar amount, but meritoriously. So if you got a bigger policy, you're getting more dividends. And it depends on how much premium you pay, how much death benefit you bought from the company. The expenses are apportioned fairly according to each and every policyholder based on the amount of pure insurance that they're buying, and other insurance coverages that are embedded in the policy. The expenses allocated, if you buy a policy, from a company, the expenses that are allocated to your policy are subtracted from your policy's gross cash value. Then the interest credits, from the three factors that I mentioned about before, those are added back in, and then that determines your net end of year cash value. So your whole life policy is designed by the insurance company so that basically, no matter what the expenses are, the guaranteed interest credits are always going to be enough to grow the cash value of the policy. And they do that because they know that the premium is going to be coming in, and they know that there's a certain rate that they have to pay. Even on policies where it's an older person and the net return might be very low, and I've actually seen whole life policies where the net return is negative, the cash value always grows, just as a function of how the policy works. But you can run into long periods of negative growth in a whole life if the person, let's say the insured's in their 70s or 80s or something, and it gets to a point where it starts to not make sense, to buy insurance anymore. Even at advanced ages, as long as that premium is paid, the cash value continues to go up. So in addition to the guaranteed growth rate, the dividend credits will give you an additional growth above and beyond that guaranteed cash value growth. So especially, anyone who's under age 60, especially when you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s even, but definitely in your, I would say 20s through 50s, the cash value growth on a policy is going to be pretty significant. You're going to see good growth, and then the dividends add to that. So unlike the guaranteed growth rate, dividend credits can and do change every year. So it kind of just depends on the performance of the company. So if investment performance is improving, then expect your dividend to go up. If it's, if the investment performance is deteriorating, then expect your dividend to deteriorate. So, and the same thing with expenses. Like if a carrier gets hit with some unexpected expenses, more people dying in a particular, this happened, during the COVID thing, and a lot of more people dying than expected. So some carriers were cutting their dividend or maintaining it, not adding to it, not increasing it, and they were having to find ways to try to maintain their dividends. Some of them chopped it because there was, just because of mortality, experience. And so carriers don't like cutting their dividend, but they will if it's just not there. If the money's not there, they can't pay it. And conversely, there's carriers that have gone back. I know of one specifically not too long ago that went back and looked at policies that were issued in the 1990s. That's a long time. I mean, it doesn't feel like it's a long time ago. I graduated high school. If this dates me, I graduated high school in 1997. But there's a carrier that went back to the 90s, all the way back to when I was a teenager, looked at policies that were sold then and figured out that their mortality experience from then to now has been much better than expected. So they went back and credited dividends based on all the mortality savings from, the past, what was it, 20, 30 years or whatever. They credited dividends back to policyholders from that time period. And so, it's kind of strange because you don't figure 30 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, whatever, after you buy a policy that you're going to be getting interest credits from that long ago when you first bought the policy. But the carriers do go back and they look at whether or not they actually did save money. It's not just a gimmick. They do actually go back and they look at whether or not they actually saved money on mortality experience or operational expenses. And if they have, they're crediting those dividends back. So, like I said, insurance companies, they don't want to decrease their dividend. They will if they have to, but they prefer to keep it stable. Just because policyholders like it, it's good for their marketing. At the same time, there's no way to guarantee that that's going to happen. So historically, life insurance company, the major mutuals, Northwestern, Mass Mutual, Guardian, Penn Mutual, those companies have tended to be fairly stable on their dividends over the last, I'd say 25, 30 years or so. They've been extraordinarily stable. And you look back over, like Penn Mutual, I think, has been paying dividends for 174, 175 consecutive years. Obviously the dividend's gone up or down during different decades, but overall, you look at the long-term dividend, and if you kind of smooth it out, it tends to be fairly stable. During the 80s, it was really high. In the 90s, it came down. But the moves were also slow. It wasn't really herky jerky. So it didn't go from 4% to 8% back down to 4% up to 5, down to 4, up to 7. It wasn't bouncing all over the place. The most bouncy dividend that I've ever received on any whole life policy has been from Mass Mutual. Not that Mass is a bad company. It's just they tend to have the most herky jerky of the mutuals, and they're still not that bad. Their dividend doesn't move that much year to year. Most of the carriers like to have a more stable dividend. They don't like having this up and down because it makes policyholders nervous, and it's just bad PR. Also, they like to be able to say, "Hey, we haven't changed our dividend in the last 10 years. It's been stable. Everybody else has been doing X, Y, Z. You put your money here and there or whatever, and your rates have gone up and down and all over the place, and we've been consistent." That's what insurance companies want to be able to tell people. We have been consistent. That's when people think of an insurance company. That's what you want to hear. You don't want to hear, we've been all over the map. What you want to hear from an insurance company is, we have been stable and consistent. So anyway, based on the current financials of the major companies and where they're at and what their lines of business look like, to me it looks like they're going to continue to do that for the foreseeable future. I don't see any major problems with the major carriers. So anyway, that's how dividends are paid, and you can kind of go a little bit deeper into dividend calculations. Although there does reach a point where carriers do not want to disclose some of the parts of how they do it, but you can also go right into their financials. Like you can dig right into the financial statements of a company, which they publish right on their website, and you can see dividend payments to policyholders. They break it out. They actually break it out as a line item. You can see it, and you can trace net income of the insurance carrier straight to the dividend payment, and you can see they made $500 million in this supplemental health policy business that they have. They made $70 million in their annuity business or whatever, and then look, it's their dividend is $570 million, and you can just piece it together and you can see the flow. You can see the premium flow of where the profits went right into the dividend payment and then right to policyholders. So they don't really hide anything of what they're doing, but they also don't tell you the exact formula that they use. I think part of it they think is, they consider that to be proprietary, and they, to me it seems kind of silly, but they you talk to the carriers and they don't want their competitors to know exactly how they're calculating the dividend, but you can see the numbers. Like I'm sure if you wanted to spend enough time, you could kind of reverse engineer how they do some of it. But you can see the premium flow, and you can see the profits, where the profits are flowing into the dividend right from their financial statements. So it's not the black box that a lot of people think it is. There is a measure of transparency there that you can see right on public information that's accessible. You don't even have to be a policyholder. You can just see it right from their financial statements that they publish publicly for everybody. And anyway, so that's how the carriers are doing their dividends and how they calculate them at least in a general sense. So I hope that helps, and I will see you in the next question next week. Thank you.
Okay, that's it for this week's question. If you'd like to add your question to the list, just drop them in the comment section or send me an email. And if you want more life insurance tips and advice, just head on over to monogenics.com, MONEGENIX.com, and sign up for my daily email list.